kind of like I got
live streaming is on.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. That's the intro that I read at first. I think I think it's John Green. If it's not John Green, it's the other one, the other brother. I think that he tries to be really objective about how to present a philosophical topic, and I will say that it's a silly 10-minute videos with some animations and some things that might help. I watched it like a long time ago, maybe 2 or 3 years, but if we need it for reference, I just posted on the chat.
No, thank you. Yeah. So, and maybe throughout the video, and we don't have to speak for 2 hours because we haven't read the text, or we're not too many of us that have studied or put a lot of work into study utilitarianism. We just keep this an hour and a half. But so maybe what's a good idea is that you guys take from what you've learned by studying the videos, but I'll start with a quote from Mill, and that'll introduce us to Mill. I'll ask a question about what you think about his general principle utilitarianism that he talks about after I mention the quote, and you can judge based on the quote and on the videos that you've seen or the lectures that you've watched. You can give your general remarks. I'm trying to find a good one in which he says, actually, there's a good quote that I think in the very, very beginning, because I'm going down the page, that he contrasts utilitarianism with other previous theories of ethics that he's encountered. And yeah, here it is. So he's talking about, before this quote, he's talking about 2 different ideas of morality, these philosophers of morality. And on one side, you have a big camp of philosophers in his day who believe that all ethics, all what's right and wrong, come from a priori principles. These principles that you don't have to think about, you don't have to find in the world, that just basically are assumptions that are built into our minds. And that's it. You don't have to have a reason for why they're true. They're just true. And then we can build an ethical theory from that. And then he also mentions the intuitionists, those philosophers that derive general principles of ethics from the natural world. They go out in the world and they derive conclusions, ethical conclusions from that world. And he says, but both hold equally, both of these kinds of philosophers, both hold equally that morality must be deduced from principles. There's a science of morals. Yet they rarely attempt to make out a list of these principles, which are to serve as the premises or assumptions of the science. Still more rarely do they make any effort to reduce those principles to one first principle, a common ground of obligation. So, and I can continue, but the reason why I point that out is because he's basically explaining, and he goes on for a few paragraphs doing this, he's explaining the project of utilitarianism. The whole point of his philosophy, he's explaining, is that he finds it odd that philosophers base what's right and wrong on a few different general principles that they get from their mind rationally, or they get from the natural world, but they don't, there should be one foundational absolute principle at the very base of that everything else in ethical theories derive from. And he eventually calls this the principle of utility, or the principle of pleasure. He actually mentions Epicurus in like the first paragraph of chapter 2. He mentions Epicurus and Jeremy Bentham, who's a later writer, but he mentions Epicurus as an inspiration for utilitarianism. What do you guys think about the principle of utility and utilitarianism? That the idea that all ethical principles about how to find out what's right and wrong come from the idea that we all we all act as if we're trying to improve our, increase our pleasure or our utility in our lives. Yeah, Gonzalo.
At first, I will say that I feel like it's not completely correct, or at least not kind of like the wording is off for me. Like pleasure, for me, it's like a different thing. I'm assuming that it's referring to something like the polarity between something like having hunger or not having hunger, and your pleasure with not having hunger. But I might be completely wrong. Assuming that, I think that kind of like it makes sense why he's kind of like thinking, as long as this polarity exists. But once that this polarity doesn't exist, I feel like he kind of like loses me, at least. There is some sort of, I would like to say that I'm more in my intuition here, that I have a certain nature not to be using utility at all. I think it's just like a push and pull thing, that it doesn't relate to the utility of things. It's more related to that interaction, and that interaction is just for the interaction itself, not with a purpose. But maybe that's kind of like my Buddhism talking, and not the actual philosophy of it.
Well, no, thank you. But that's a good first start. Also, you make a good point. What does he actually mean by pleasure or utility? And I want to get to that in just a second, but I want to hear from other general remarks, because that is actually a good paragraph in chapter 2 that he basically does that. He's like, okay, first of all, let's clear up the whole confusion about what we mean by these terms. But Alvaro, I think you wanted to say something first.
Yeah, something, and I'm not related to what we were discussing at first with regards to readings. I think when it comes to readings, I'm going to make the analogy with the Stoic readings, which is that there are books that are modern and they can give you like a survey of previous authors in a way that you don't have to go to the original writings. And not only because the writings themselves may be written in a translation or in the language using old terms, but also because of the historical context. I think it is very important to keep the historical context. And sometimes modern books that give you the survey of the previous authors give you like the progress, not only putting things in historical context, but the progress historically speaking. So in Stoicism, for example, I don't think we, even though we like to go to the primary sources, and even though the old Stoa, they have very little writings, I don't think we have up to now gone to one of the writings of Zeno, right? So with that said, I think when it comes to the utilitarian philosophy, a lot of it has gained more of importance nowadays, because of things that have to do with morals, have to do with ethics, but it's not so much, they haven't been seen so much in the context of the individual as of in the context of us as society. And that term utility, I am assuming that when John Stuart Mill was writing about it, we were coming from a process in which virtue ethics was coming from maybe Stoicism. Then the church got involved, and virtue was not only a concept that was linked to philosophy, but it was linked to religion. Then we have Machiavelli, that is basically speaking against being virtuous, but not being virtuous as from the Stoic perspective, but a concept of virtue that was very linked to the church at the time, and a church that was corrupt. Popes that were not conducting themselves as, not even as we know the popes today, but when we read about the Borgias and how priesthood and the popes at the time were being elected and all the politics that were going on, I mean, Machiavelli was indeed, if you see it from that perspective, he was like a prophet speaking against a lot of things that were corrupt in the church itself. And then you take that is, church, then a virtue that comes from church. But there is a whole political system that gets transferred, or that is, it overlaps not only with what happens at church. It's at the time church and state were basically one and the same, but then up until these days we see those things in different systems or political environments or institutions. So what I'm trying to point out is that I think for Mills to speak about pleasure and make it equal to utility, that may hold true back then, not necessarily in the context of discussing the philosophy today. Utility today is basically a benefit. If you want to put it in religious terms, maybe a blessing, but it's not necessarily pleasure. If you want to put it in economic terms, it may be measured through monetary terms, but it doesn't have to be money. It doesn't have to be pleasure. It doesn't have to be.
So could I just jump in and clarify? So you mean, and I kind of do agree that today we use the word utility in a different way. So like utility is more like usefulness, like what's beneficial to us, but not necessarily what makes us happy or pleasurable, correct? Is that what you mean?
Utility, and that's why it ends up being mathematical today. When you start discussing game theory or statistics, game theory is basically what it is, but it's a branch of mathematics, a branch of statistics and probability. Utility, it's, you assign numbers to it, but you don't know what that number represents. It may be, if you put it in the context of economics, it may represent money, it may represent currency. But if you put it in the context of pleasure, it's harder to, add measures to pleasure. But if you want to, you can still do it. And you can say, hey, maybe we're going to assign a 10 or 100 to the pleasure you get by engaging in sex. And we're going to assign a number 5 or 50 to the pleasure you get by so and so. And then you start making comparisons. But I may be speaking very loosely on what I perceive and I understand. I don't want to misspeak. But where I want to bring this is to the idea of I think coming from economics, but bringing it back to philosophy, we oftentimes are in a situation that is similar to the one that you brought up in the passive of we're driving and maybe, okay, do we kill one person or kill multiple people? But it's not the same scenario. But we're oftentimes maybe putting in a scenario in which it's either you as an individual or the system. So in corporate America, we speak about examples of whistleblowing, for example. Or in economics, we speak about concepts of, do we save the banks? Do we give them a free pass by saving the banks and not allowing them to come under? Or do we save the whole economy? So in the context of philosophy, we may be put in a situation, politically speaking, in which it's either, the truth comes out and you as an individual speak out for the quote unquote good of your good or the good of a few, because the truth is being brought up. But then if that truth is putting at risk the whole institution, then is there really gain? Is it better to, shut that person off, prevent that person from speaking? What is more, where do you get the most gain? Where do you get the most utility? I think that's a good example of utilitarianism that doesn't necessarily involve pleasure, doesn't necessarily involve currency, but it's basically telling you, hey, what is more beneficial? The welfare of the whole society, of the whole group, of the institution, of the community, or the idea of gaining utility or pleasure in the Stoic context from being virtuous and speaking the truth.
Just before Gonzalo, before you go, but no, I also agree with you, Alvaro, in the sense that utility today and how it's used in language, it has a different meaning than just straight up pleasure or happiness. And you are right. I know that in economics, it's often used as a concept because they usually take inspiration from Mill and from traditional capitalist writings, like Adam Smith, and who also took ideas from utilitarianism to understand how rational agents would operate and consume and produce in society. So you are right that economics, they take a lot of inspiration from utilitarianism. And I do agree there should be a difference understood between utility and pleasure. But just before Gonzalo goes, actually, this is the quote I wanted to share. If you check the chat, this is from his chapter 2 on utilitarianism. And this paragraph basically says what he's trying to say. In the paragraph before, he also makes explicit that when he says utility, he's saying the same thing as pleasure. So for him, utility, happiness, and pleasure are basically the same things. He doesn't really find a distinction in them, at least just through book 2, like chapter 2. Like chapters 1 and 2, he doesn't really elucidate a difference between them. I haven't read any further because the second chapter, he says, is just on what is utilitarianism and demything it. But he doesn't exactly go into his formulas of utility and so forth to actually tell you what he means by utility, pleasure, and happiness. But he does basically make an equality with them. He's using them as synonyms. And so that's what I just wanted to say, is that for Mill, he's defining utility as pleasure and happiness. They're the same thing for him. Yeah. So when he says increases utility, he's saying promoting happiness or basically staying away from pain. And he doesn't in this paragraph, but he quotes the Epicureans. He basically refers to the Epicureans like over and over again. He even has a whole paragraph on that starts with, when thus attacked, the Epicureans have always answered. He's defending the Epicureans. He mentions the Epicureans quite a lot because he thinks that they're pretty much one of the earliest philosophical schools that adopted utilitarianism in contrast to Stoicism, which is why I thought this was a great topic, because it did kind of match Epicureanism a little bit, and it's a good concept to dig into. But yeah, you make a good point, Alvaro, that there should be a difference. It sounds like, and it feels like there's a difference between mere utility, things that are useful and beneficial to us, versus things that are pleasurable or make us happier. I have a follow-up questions, but Gonzalo, go right ahead if you wanted to say something.
Yeah, my kind of question was related to because my focus on utility was related to gains, not to usefulness of something. Kind of like when you have revenue. I'm not sure if I'm using. Brain is saying that from there to whether if in this year or context the utility word means something different. I kind of I didn't know, but the more I read the text, the quote that you post, I feel like I'm drawn to that concept, that it's like a gain from doing something. It's like you're avoiding pain, it's a gain. You're generating pleasure, it's a gain, versus a loss that will be feeling pain or displeasure. But I also think that kind of his whole idea is based on the polarity of things. But I also feel like there are more things in between, that not just the two extremes. Like yeah, when you put them into this choice, for me, it's like, oh yeah, of course. Who would like to have a leg cut out? Oh, nobody. I feel like that sort of thing. It's also the thing that we do in Stoicism. We prevent ourselves from doing that thing where we limit our thoughts and our ideas to be polarized with something, and said like, oh, there are many options of this, many stages. Most of those things tend to be prefer indifference, I think they are called. I always forget the name, I'm sorry. But kind of like, we focus on the it wouldn't be made any difference if I had this or not, so I don't need to think about it. Ta-da! But I feel like he's kind of like forcing us to move into this perspective of polarity, so that the things that he says make sense. But that's kind of like me. I might be angry too. Sorry.
No, it is frustrating to hear a philosopher you don't agree with, because then you gotta get at him. So I mean, actually, just to dispel some misconceptions that before Paul, you jump in. Thanks for joining us, by the way. I didn't get a chance to say hello. Alvaro made the point to say that if you like label pain or pleasure by like a 5 or a 6 from like a scale of 1 to 10, that's kind of what Mill eventually goes into, is that Mill is not saying that there's necessarily a polarity. So I know what you're saying. Maybe what you're saying is that there's only pleasure versus pain, and then you have a scale in between, versus, well, utilitarianism then sounds one-dimensional, where you have one axis, on the end is pleasure, on the end is pain, and you can move between them, but then you can't really, there's no other axis, there's no other dimension off of which to assess what is right or wrong. You only assess what is right or wrong based upon how much pleasure or pain there is. And that's very, very delimiting. But there are gray areas in between those. So Mill is in support of obviously understanding if there's a scale. I think a good example of this, a good practical and probably a more useful example we would all agree with, is if you've ever heard of the way in which stings from bees and insects are rated. There's actually a rating system they've invented that that there's this one guy or a couple of scientists in the past who have quite literally just stung themselves with various insects, and then just wrote down pain numbers on a scale of like 1 to 30 or something. And so that's basically utilitarianism in a biological sense. That's what he was doing. So
yeah, but kind of like it feels like the problem that I had with my friends. I had a dinner this weekend, and we started asking who likes spicy and who doesn't like spicy, and everybody had a different value for that word. How much is spicy? And then we got into this complicated discussion about, yeah, but for me that 7 that for you is bad, for me it's really good. So how are we dealing with this individual thing as well? I think that's kind of like the other half of my argument, that it's not there.
Yeah. And I'm going to switch to Paul in just a second, because I have to say I can't answer that. It's more of, yeah, I know what you're saying. Like, I haven't gotten to the part whether he says the end of those scales of pleasure or pain, most pleasure, most pain, is objective, or if they're subjective based on the person, but everybody still orients themselves towards pleasure. So I'm not sure which one it is. I think it would be the latter. I don't think Mill is that delimiting himself or restricting himself. I think he would understand that people have scales at different places along the spectrum, but that they still have that scale. They still have a pleasure to pain scale. Paul?
Okay, so thanks for having me. When I think of Mill, I always think of the US Declaration of Independence, like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And I've never seen anything wrong in happiness, prosperity, wealth. I've never seen anything wrong. For me, it's just a neutral thing, like prosperity, wealth. It's just, it may be a goal in your life, it may be a goal in my life, and I would see it as a neutral goal, really. But, so this is basically a very broad statement, kind of my first thoughts. But to go maybe more in depth, the second link you shared was also quite interesting, as I also posted in the chat here, where Mill is saying that I do not mean to assert that the promotion of happiness should be itself the end of all actions. And then he continues on to say that there are many virtuous actions and even virtuous modes of action by which happiness in the particular instance is sacrificed and more pain is being produced than pleasure. So I guess what I'm trying to say with that is it would be very good for me, at least, to kind of cross-reference all of Mill's work, and I'm pretty sure there's a PhD thesis about it, to actually see what did he mean by pain, pleasure, happiness, wealth, abundance, prosperity, if at all, if it's at all possible. Maybe there's a computer model or like AI-based tool to derive these, because what he believed or what he had written is probably different than my definitions anyway. But again, coming back to the beginning, I wouldn't see anything wrong about wealth, prosperity, abundance, happiness, or so as the sole pursuit of life. But I'm happy to read the book as well to maybe see what else it brings. Maybe it clarifies a few things for me as well.
Yeah, I haven't. I've only been reading his work online, but I do like how you put the quote, because I think there's a difference between what Mill is saying he's observing in daily life and what he's trying to say should be the case. And I think because this is not a translation. I mean, he's writing in English. That I think it's good that you post the quote, because in the first quote that I post, he's just elucidating the principle of utility. And it's more so, oh, this is what I've observed people usually do in society. They say they're doing something because it's right because of first principles, because it's right to do that. Whereas they're not really accepting the fact that they're only doing that because it's pleasurable or making them happy. And to him, I think it's more of a deception on their part to go ahead and act in such a way and say, yeah, but I'm doing it because it's right, when in fact, most of them are just doing it because it's really making them pleasurable or happy, and they're not accepting that fact, or that it's boosting their utility, it's boosting their benefit to themselves. Which is not a bad thing. You say it's not inherently a bad thing. In some cases, it's a bad thing when it produces awful consequences. But in most cases, like you say, Paul, in some cases that it just happens to align, doing what's good or happy or pleasurable for yourself happens to align with other ethical values. But I think the operative word here is should be, and itself the end of all actions. He's like imploring people to say, well, I'm not saying that happiness is the end. I'm saying, but it shouldn't be the end to all actions. There's other cases in which you can be virtuous, and it's still requiring a little bit more pain than pleasure. I think he's also clarifying it. I mean, he's still on board with the principle of utility. He's not just explaining it and then dismissing it, because that wouldn't be the whole point of his book on utilitarianism. So he's not dismissing the principle of utility. But I do have follow-up questions about that, because I think he's saying something more. But it is good to also contrast with his system of logic, in which he also talks about how he makes this statement, which is good. Is this, you say page, I have just one question, page 658 and 659. Are you taking this from the online version or from the book that you bought by him?
It's the online version, because I think it's the second book, isn't it? It's the second link of yours, and also not something that I have as a hard copy.
Oh, okay. Okay, I just didn't know, because it said page 658 and 659. I didn't even, I wasn't paying attention to the page numbers in the online text. Yeah, good point. Alvaro, I think it was you who raised your hand, right? Okay.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good quote, the one that Paul brought up. And something that we can conclude from that quote for sure is that, at least from a utilitarian perspective, happiness is not the same definition that we use in Stoicism, because he's saying there are many virtuous actions by which happiness in the particular instance is sacrificed. And we know that cannot happen in Stoicism, because in Stoicism, virtueness or the good life is happiness. I mean, happiness as of in the good life. So that for sure we can see from that quote, which is that there is a conflict in the definition, loosely speaking, of what happiness is.
Yeah, it's also good to remind yourself that. But you're right, there is a bit of a conflict when you forfeit the idea of virtue in place of happiness as the ultimate end. That being said, you are right to remind us that Stoicism still does claim that it is considered a eudaimonistic philosophy, a philosophy that says the goal of philosophy and the goal of life is to live a good life, is to be happy. Yeah, I also don't like that translation, happiness, for eudaimonia. A good life, a flourishing life sounds better, because it feels like you're also saying that it doesn't have to necessarily be pleasurable. It just has to make you feel like you're a good person. That's basically what it means. You want to feel like you're a good person. You want to feel comfortable and peace of mind, which is not necessarily pleasurable. It just means that you're at peace of mind, which sounds a lot better. But it is still good to remind ourselves that they still thought that a good life was the end of Stoicism, whereas virtue was at that same point. You have to aim for virtue, but that virtue was not necessarily a means to the end of a good life. It simply coincided with it. It was like you aim for virtue, you become virtuous, and you happen to get a good life. And that was a really important point for them. Not just a byproduct. It was kind of like at the same level. And so it also can't help to be ignored. It can't help. We can't help but to admit that Stoicism and Epicureanism, in some way, just to some extent, said that a good life or eudaimonia or some means of happiness or tranquility was kind of a goal of philosophy, just as much as virtue was. But I do agree that Epicureans like Mill went too far in the principle of utility, that it was pleasure specifically that was equated to happiness and utility. That was a little bit too far. Like, why can there not be anything more? But I do like that Mill puts this in context. Yeah, go ahead, Alvaro. To jump in.
Even the concept of pleasure, maybe we're also taking it too far as to think of pleasure in terms of, like sexual pleasure or something along those lines, in which there is something physical or something like an exorcist, right? I would like to bring up again the example of Nelson Mandela that I brought up last week. So let's put ourselves in a situation like that, in which we either have to live according to our values, and we can claim that those values are Stoic values. Either we live according to those values, but we have to go to prison for the next 30 years of our life, or to some extent, we forfeit those values. Forfeit in the sense of, maybe, I'm not saying that if you don't go to jail, you don't live according to those values anymore, but you're put in a situation in either you hold on to those values and you go to jail for what you believe, or you don't hold on to those values as strongly and you don't go to jail. So I think in that context, utility has a better, we can have a better understanding of what utility is. Because not going to jail is not necessarily like you're in ecstasy or you are in pleasure or you're like enjoying yourself. You're just avoiding something that it's going to be detrimental for your life. By most people, by not going so much into philosophy or academic understanding, I think most people will, especially if you don't know if you have 30 more years of life, most people will understand going to jail for the next 30 years as something that is detrimental to your life. So in that sense, I think the concept of utility has a better meaning. And the context of, and the sense of virtue not being the only thing that brings you happiness or utility also has, more meaning to us in that context.
Gonzalo.
Yes, but I think that we are also forgetting one part. It's I feel like your benefit, you're kind of like you're creating a benefit where there's actually none. Kind of like let's do a mental exercise. Will Mandela be Mandela if he hadn't been to prison for 30 years? Will people have trust in Mandela for a lot of different political issues when he uphold his values this high? Or if it was just like a random politician that had flexible values? And I think that that's kind of like slightly the point in Stoicism. We are warned not to sell ourselves short, right? I cannot remember the quote now, and I'm trying to search it in my brain, but I
Well,
cannot
I think
remember.
the example of Mandela used to bring it down to earth, but it's really the example of game theory of the prisoner's dilemma. But this is not to say that many people have faced similar situations in different regimes, in different countries, right? We can take examples from people like if you go to Miami, you'll probably at some point come across a Cuban exile who can tell you about whatever difficulties he or she faced in Cuba, and it was either it was either speaking up for what they thought it was true or going to jail, for example, and that's why they left the island. And
No,
I'm
no,
sure
but
that many.
that's the thing that's the kind of like the point that I'm trying to make. It's like we are favoring somehow the fact that those people left the bad regime, right, in search for a better life, to improve themselves or their chances, right? And we are treating that as uh, kind of like higher value than the other thing, whatever the other thing is. When I think it's not. Kind of like that's a completely opinion on yourself, because
No. I am not saying that it's of less value. What I'm saying is that Mill is basically saying, making the parallel in between Stoicism and church. Maybe church or Stoicism is telling you, hey, this is virtue. This is the only good. And either you live by this or you are not being virtuous, and thus you're not living the good life and you're not being happy. And Mills is telling you, hey, wait a minute. I think, borrowing from the quote that Paul brought up, which I don't think I can rephrase it even better, but I think the idea that Mills is saying is like, there are cases in which you may be virtuous, but that may not be giving you happiness in the context that Mills is using the term happiness. And I think he's raising the question. He's saying he's basically coming up through utilitarianism with, and that's why the question that Steve was also bringing up at the beginning, it's questioning the assumptions that were coming from. He's basically coming up with a philosophy in which is making you question the assumptions and ask you, hey, maybe by not being virtuous, or as in the definition of Stoicism or the church, you can still be happy, maybe happier, and maybe there is nothing wrong about it. Maybe if you leave the island because you don't want to spend the rest of your years in jail speaking up against a regime that you don't agree with, and there is nothing wrong with that. But if you're gonna spend the rest of your life in jail versus living in liberty in another country, why not go on and live the rest of your life in another country, have a family, bear children, go for an education, get employment, live those 30 years outside of jail? There is nothing wrong with it, versus having a narrow perspective and think virtuousness is holding on to my values, and thus I have to spend the next 30 years in jail holding
yes,
on
but
to
that's what I'm saying. You're using the word narrowed, which is an opinion. You're adding opinion to the thoughts, to the actual facts. It's kind of like, yeah, of course, I'm not judging someone that says like, fuck this shit, I will leave and go to Miami. I'm not judging them. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't add kind of like a weight into whether if a person does one thing and a person does another thing. I think that's what it's kind of like making me a lot of noise inside my head. Is each person, it's free of doing whatever they want with their own life. And kind of like, I think that when we start to add value to that, an opinion to those things, kind of like, living this way sounds wrong or feels wrong, or living this other way feels wrong or is wrong, we are creating the problem. But I also feel like Stoicism is not doing that. It's not saying you have to have these values. It's saying you have to kind of like be guided by these pillars. There are the things that we think that are the best, but if you can come up with something else, we are all for it. Go. And,
Yeah,
and kind of like, and I think that that's kind of like the point here. There's like a clear judgment from Miller perspective. I'm not sure if judgment is the correct word. I'm sorry. That relates to that. It's kind of like, of course, people prefer to be happy. So it's, you can do it. Go, be happy. That's it.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things both of you saying that are correct. But again, like it's also good to point out that yes, you're right. It's comparing the example, like using the example of one person staying in jail to stand up for his virtues versus somebody who leaves the island to have a family and be free in another country, may both be acting virtuous, but you don't treat them like on a scale of 1 to 10. You don't say, well, the guy leaving the island is not bad, he's just living like a 5, and the guy living in prison is more like a 10. No, you don't treat them like a scale, because Stoicism would rather say, no, it depends on the goal that you're targeting towards. They're both acting virtuously, and it's not, they don't have different ideas of virtue. They're both acting wisely, courageously, temperately, and justly, because they're acting in accordance with their goals set in mind, their goals which are virtuous in and of itself, to go to another country, to be free, to live out your life to the fullest, and to have a family, and to grow a family, and to grow a career, are good things. So that's being virtuous. But if your goal is to lead a country and just be the voice of a people, and to publish important works and to change the course of history, and then you leave the island and escape and then try and do that, then you're not being virtuous, because your goal was to change the course of history, to fight for your ideals, and yet you left your country to do that. That doesn't make any sense. Stay in prison and be a model for other people. Write your essays in prison. But if your goal is to raise a family, if your goal is, if you're sitting in prison, and not everybody is a freedom fighter, that's okay. If you're in prison sitting like, I don't want to be a freedom fighter, my goal is not to change the world, my goal is to have a simple life as a farmer, live with a family, then that's fine. That's being virtuous. Go out and escape and live in another country and grow a family. So it depends on your goal. Of course, the goals have to be virtuous in and of itself as well. But there can be two different options that are equally virtuous. And remember, the Stoics never thought there was a scale of virtue. It's either virtuous or not. There's no in between. So you can't also give a gradations of virtue. I mean, you can object to that. It's fine if you object to the idea that, there's only one, it's either one end of the extreme. It's either virtuous or not. And there has to be some gray areas. You can disagree with that, but then you're not talking about Stoicism anymore. So it's just a clarification. But there was something else I wanted to point out. I just also wanted to clarify, Alvaro, before you jump back in. I wanted to clarify Mill's quote that Paul scurried up. After finding it, I realized it was basically towards the end of that chapter, very, very, very end. And he says right after that quote, so after he says, blah, blah, the quote that Paul posted, he then says, I fully admit that this is true, that the cultivation of an ideal nobleness of will and conduct should be to individual human beings an end, to which the specific pursuit either of their own happiness or that of others should in the case of a conflict give way. In other words, what he's saying is, but I hold that so he's basically saying that character is and nobleness of will is still an important end. And if it conflicts with your happiness, then the happiness should give way to the pursuit of nobleness of character. However, he clarifies this, something that I think the Stoics would disagree with. He then goes on to say, but I hold that he keeps saying but in every sentence. Like he has to always clarify what he says before. He says, but I hold that the very question, what constitutes this elevation of character, is itself to be decided by a reference to happiness as the standard. What he's saying is that, yes, character and nobleness of will, which is interesting. This is not about your example, Alvaro. I just wanted to point out his clarification. Mill is saying that character and virtue are still important. However, when you define an ideal character or ideal virtue to live by, that always has to be referred to what you mean by happiness. So if you imagine, like, you know how the Stoics envision an ideal Stoic, an ideal sage, and to try and model yourself off of? Well, Mill is saying the same thing, but Mill is saying is that when you envision the ideal person, the ideal sage, who's all virtuous and all good character, you shouldn't envision somebody who's miserable but living by their standards. So he's a stubborn, virtuous person living by his standards. What he's, not to say that's a bad thing, but just to give some clarity, what he's saying is that if that virtuous person or person full of character is not happy, then you're envisioning that person wrong. And I think that's what he's saying, which is quite peculiar. He's tying the idea of virtue to happiness in a way that's a bit distorted from what the Stoics thought. I just thought I should point that out, that he clarifies that yes, virtue and character are important, but you have to still tie them in reference to happiness in their ideals, which I thought was it's a very small part, but Alvaro.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I don't think that what utilitarianism is doing is assigning a scale or values to try to determine who's being more virtuous than who. For example, and again, I think it's very similar to the example of driving a car and having to decide in between killing 4 people versus 3. But that example, I feel it is a poor representation of the dilemma that you are facing when you're making such a decision. When you are driving and you have to decide whether to kill a mother and her baby who's just starting life, and 4 people who are grown-up adults, or maybe it's either the mother and the child and the president of the country, right? So this person is leading a country. So there are different ways to assign values or utility to each one of the scenarios. And that is not necessarily saying this is more virtuous than the other, or it's that's why utility is encompassing so many ideas at the same time. And its strength is that it's encompassing so many ideas, and it's also its weakness, right? Because you don't know if that is happiness, you don't know if that is importance. I don't think it is indeed trying to measure virtuousness and saying, hey, this person is more virtuous than the other, but it's definitely trying to come up with what is the best outcome. And the outcome, loosely speaking, that is benefiting the most. So I like to think in terms more of this case happens all the time, happens all the time. And it is when you have a whistleblower within an organization, and maybe, for example, you're part of the government or you're part of church, and you realize that the head minister or the head of the country is having an affair. And if you leak that affair, that is gonna have an influence on the people going to church, or it's gonna have an influence in the business of the government, and it's going to be detrimental for the congregation, or it's going to be detrimental for the people in that country. So the idea is that maybe you can hold on to some assumptions that will tell you, hey, you gotta vent this out, that is being sincere, that is being virtuous, but maybe that is having some harmful effects, versus the idea of, hey, if you don't say that, I know this is controversial, especially today, but the idea being that maybe if you don't speak out, you'll be benefiting more people. And I think this is also a poor example because it's dealing with the character of a leader. But I see why economics is so used, because it's so it's not as controversial when it is being used as controversial, even though it is controversial. Because when you're speaking about banks, these are institutions. You don't speak about the character of a bank or for banks, right? But it's the same idea. It's either you benefit a couple institutions and avoid harming society even more by bailing the banks, or you don't benefit and maybe you harm society, but at the end you're basically giving the banks a free pass because they are in that situation because of the mismanagement they had. Again, loosely speaking, that's the idea. So I feel this is very much also linked to, even though Mills may not say it, but it's coming from the idea of religion and virtuousness within Christianity, right? In Christianity, we are taught that we have to forgive. In Christianity, we are taught that if somebody slaps you in one face, you put the other on one cheek, you put the other cheek. If somebody's oppressing you and is forcing you to carry his luggage for 1 mile, you don't do it for 1 mile, you do it for 2 miles, right? So I think Mills is actually challenging the idea that these type of assumptions that I'm bringing up from a Christian context that we may encounter in our context, such as Stoicism, he's challenging that, or he's at least making us think of the dilemma, and he's making us think, okay, is that truly beneficial for you? Is that truly beneficial for society? And how about this scenario? Is it really being beneficial for you? Is it really being virtuous, becoming the whistleblower, and then in some sense, becoming responsible for the harm of this group of people, because just because you feel you're so virtuous, you got to speak up the truth, that is gonna ruin, the idea of that these people have about the institution or the leader, and then they will give up on that institution that leader represents and the values that come with it, right? So
are you, just to clarify, because I got confused at the very end when you ended with that recapping of the example. So wait, you mean how maybe speaking up or speaking out for your virtues or values in society, that if you do so publicly, sometimes, or you're giving, not sometimes in general, but maybe you're giving a specific example in which you're trying to act virtuous. You're doing so publicly, but doing so then influences everybody else who had been living in kind of an ignorance or kind of an acceptance or understanding with the state and its power. And maybe that authority is being used or abused wrongly. And so when you speak out upon your virtues, you're then disturbing their kind of equanimity. You're disturbing their way of life. They have second thoughts. They start feeling worse about their state and their society. And then there's conflict between the people and the state. And you feel that in some cases, like that example, that acting virtuously is not really acting virtuously, because you're not, when you're standing up to for your values, sometimes it should be unspoken, so that preserve kind of the peace. I didn't really understand what you meant.
Yeah, let's assume that I find out something about you, Steve, as the leader of this group, right? Maybe I find out that Steve is like he has another group going on, and it's not about the Stoicism, it's about being a skeptic. And he promotes in the other group that he's a skeptic, and he trashes Stoicism in the other group. And I find out. And then I'm like, hey, I gotta tell the people in the Stoic group about this. Steve is such a hypocrite. He's telling us all these things about the Stoicism. When they find out, nobody will believe him anymore. But I know that if I come to this group and I tell them about this, it's not only gonna ruin their perception about you, they will give up on Stoicism altogether, all of them. And in that sense, I will be harming their progress in Stoicism. So what is more virtuous? Do I keep quiet, or do I come to the group and tell them about you and the skeptic group, right?
So, yeah, speaking of which, I do have to tell you, for a little while now, I've been a bit skeptic. And it was a funny example, actually. I wish you used that example in the first place, besides the whole political one. Then this would have been a more interesting conversation. So now that clarifies what you mean, because then, okay, I was right. That's your interpretation. I have some problems with that, but I understand where you're coming from, because the idea of disturbing equanimity or tranquility is a big deal in Stoicism. However, maybe I'll let Gonzalo speak first. He raised his hand a while ago.
I mean, I feel like we have a lot of problems with that argument in general, because is it, at least in Stoicism, we are reminded all of the time to not depend to another human being for being your moral compass or something like that. I don't remember again the exact quote. We are remembered that we should be our own moral compass, and that we should try to follow ourselves, not another person. So when that other person goes away or has a problem, then you're not kind of like lost in the nothingness of nothing. I think that that's kind of like the first thing that we have over there. The next one is, I also think that you're valuing peace and quiet over kind of like ripping off a bandit too much. I think that in that comparison, you're kind of like you're adding a lot of value into the current status quo versus to the new status quo that will come after a transition period. And kind of like I'm pro changing the status quo usually. So, for example, I don't know, with the HSBC problem, with the bank that occurred, I think it was around 10 years ago, and the US government decided to not to do anything harm to the bank for doing money laundering, because it will destroy the economy of the USA and the world, allegedly. Was that a correct decision to keep the system in the way that it's currently is? Will that change be beneficial for us now? And now we are paying with the consequences of maintaining that decision right now. I think that are some sort of the questions that you're also living outside of the thinking box. I think
No. It is exactly.
Will this I don't know.
It is the
civil
status
war
quo.
that will last 1 year will create more prosperity in the future. Is that my decision to make? Do I believe that I'm so important and that I have a lot of credibility for people to trust the things that I'm saying? I think that sort of thing is there should be inside the thinking box, and for some reason you're not putting them inside the thinking box.
I'm just using that as an example. The two groups and whatnot.
No, I know, but kind of like I'm also that's also the thing that I'm saying. Kind of like if you want to really put things into perspective, you really have to think in more aspects of the things that you're trying to let's say, found a solution for it. because otherwise it will not be complete somehow. It's like you're thinking in just one small perspective of that, without considering all of the other things that are in that huge process, let's say.
The idea of giving an example, Gonzalo, is so that I don't have to list every single case, right? But you're right in that it is a status quo type of example, in which is a type of a scenario in which you're challenging the status quo. That is completely right. And I'm not trying to promote one decision over another. I'm just trying to point out this is a dilemma that we face as individuals and as a society. And I think this is what the utilitarian philosophy is being used to address. And I'm trying to put it in the context of Stoicism. Maybe that's why I used the Stoic and this group as an example. And maybe bringing up Stoic values and say, okay, from Stoicism, most likely we will be inclined to do this, but from a utilitarian perspective, and from a perspective in which, again, utility is not only looked as pleasure, or is not only looked as happiness, but it's either, even avoiding harm can be perceived as utility. But what is the best choice, right?
Yeah, but that's kind of like the thing that I'm trying to point out. Maybe I'm not being really good at it, but kind of like it is a dilemma as long as you put it in that place of dilemma. It's not a dilemma the moment that you remove kind of like a lot of opinions that you may have around that topic. Kind of like the moment that you transform that dilemma into something more, let's say, logical, that dilemma goes away and the solution is right away. I'm not really sure if it's shown right away, or kind of like at least it gets a little bit clearer about the things that you should do. That's maybe my complete personal opinion, and maybe I'm trying to enforce it, but yeah, kind of like that's why I go about it.
I think it's the problem could also arise from, I think Gonzalo is partially right in the sense of, it depends on your expecting of what your interpretation of the people's state of mind is in Gonzalo, in Alvaro's political example. And I think Alvaro is partially right in the sense that if you do take one perspective, you could interpret voicing your virtues or values as disrupting other people's happiness, eudaimonia, and equanimity in one sense. But I think that's also kind of a perversion of that perspective, of the perspective for what is virtue and what is not. Because for example, by speaking out in these examples and disrupting other people's tranquility or status quo, you're assuming two things. You're assuming, one, that they're not doing anything unvirtuous. When I was trying to find a quote, but I couldn't find the exact quote, and I don't think the quotes they give are correct. But so there's something Plato said in one of his dialogues, something to the liking of, your silence gives your consent. That, okay, the people may be okay with the status quo, but because they're okay with the status quo and they're not doing anything about the status quo, they're kind of being unvirtuous. So are you also going to be unvirtuous by not speaking out? So if by not speaking out because you don't want to disrupt other people's equanimity, I'm concerned that you're also you're assuming that they're not doing anything unvirtuous in the beginning. And then there's the other problem about how you're also assuming something more. And I think we're because in these examples, we're assuming too much about what other people are doing. We're also assuming that those other people, I think we're definitely assuming that they're ignorant, which is fine. Maybe they are ignorant. And that's a whole nother story. But I think we're assuming too much more. We're assuming that they are happy with the situation, that just because they're peaceful or they're quiet about the status quo means that they're happy or they're tranquil or they're comfortable with it. And I don't think that's correct. Just because somebody is quiet about it or silent about it doesn't mean that they're okay about it. It doesn't even mean that they accept or that they agree with the status quo. They could hate the status quo. They could want it to change, but they just won't say anything, maybe because they're frightened for their physical safety, for some other reason. But I think we're assuming too much about the people, that we don't necessarily go with. So I'm not saying that they're definitely most people want that they change in the status quo, or that most people are acting unvirtuously when they're being silent. But what I'm saying is that we shouldn't be assuming too much about what other people in society are thinking or believing or feeling, because I think that definitely runs against virtue ethic Stoicism, like not even virtue ethic, kind of the physics part of Stoicism, that they don't want you to they don't want you to assent to judgments or observations that may be incorrect. So the observation of people being quiet, don't assent to that, because you need to kind of withhold assent, and until you determine for sure, maybe by speaking to them, if what their feelings or ideas about the situation actually are. So I think that's kind of a violation of like Stoic physics in that sense, that you're accepting assent too quickly to a judgment. So I think that that's the problem that arises in the situation. I don't think the problem in your examples are all necessarily ethical. They're more physical. We're assuming too much about the other people in that situation. And I think that in and of itself is actually inhibiting us. It's like it's forcing us unable to actually make an ethical decision, because we don't know what other people are doing. And I think that forces us to realize that Stoicism, and I think Utilitarianism also, to an extent, forces us to realize we should do not necessarily what's in our own right, like what we do for ourselves. That's not what they're saying. Because both Utilitarianism and Stoicism sometimes say that you should do things for other people. It just depends on for whatever reason. Utilitarianism for the greatest number, Stoicism because it's just. But they're saying that you should do what you know be virtuous, regardless of what other people are or what you expect them or think of them doing afterwards. I think it also brings us back to the kind of the center of Stoicism, to kind of do what is virtuous based upon what is virtuous, not based upon what other people are telling you is virtuous, even though it's wrong. Yeah. That was a long spiel, but there was a lot to unpack between you guys. And I had a lot of thoughts running through my mind. So, Gonzalo, you raised your hand before. I didn't know if you wanted to come back to a point you wanted to make.
But it's okay. You mentioned everything that I want to mention, so I think it's awesome. Thank you.
Okay. But I also had a follow-up question for everybody, because technically this goes to 8:30, but we can spend just another 15-20 minutes on this and then head out. We don't have to necessarily wait until 8:30. But I think a good question to ask is Mill saying necessarily that, and I think he is saying, but so because this is not the most important question, is Mill saying that, for example, the Stoics are saying that this is virtuous because it's virtuous. This is virtuous because it's wise, it's temperate, it's just, it's courageous, and you should do it because it's virtuous, and you should do it so that you live a good life in your eudaimonic. And Mill is saying, well, that may be true, right? An end may be virtuous, sure. But you're actually doing it because in the end, after that, it really improves your happiness. No matter what you consciously think, you're an animal and you're just doing it because you are doing it because it's making you happy or increasing your benefit. And my bigger question after that is, do you think that's what the Stoics are actually doing? And I know some of us may agree that the Stoics are not fooling themselves, but Mill seems to be saying that's what most people are doing when they don't admit that avoiding pain and accepting pleasure is making a goal as pleasure is when they're not admitting that, they're kind of fooling themselves. They're disguising their real intents for ethical action with other ends like pure virtue or pure eudaimonia, and instead they're actually doing this for happiness, for utility, for pleasure. Do you think that's what the Stoics are doing? And do you think this is also not just for the Stoics? Do you think this is a general phenomenon in real life? I didn't know if my question was
I'll respond to that. So maybe something that I didn't realize that I did say, and I think it can be put in that context, but I didn't know if that's what Mills it's after, is that I did mention that what makes you more virtuous, either telling the truth and speaking out and maybe going against the status quo or keeping quiet. So I think it could be used for that, but I don't think Mills is necessarily seeking for him or for the individual or for a group of people to necessarily be more virtuous, but it's more like what is more beneficial. And that's where the term utility comes up. And I do believe that comes up all the time. Cases in which being virtuous, as per the definition of Stoicism or other group, may be, from a utilitarian perspective, may be detrimental for the individual or for society. And the question is, or not, it's not that what's the question is that we encounter those type of situations all the time. And yeah, I do believe it happens in society all the time.
Gonzalo.
While I think that most of the humans, and I want to specifically address humans, because I feel like the animals, they don't do that. They don't pursue pleasure for pleasure itself. I think that they have like a whole different balance and a way of working, same as plants. But I think that one of the main problems of human is related to perception. And until we destroy the perception of what pleasure is, we don't, or what pleasure or displeasure is, or suffering is, until we don't reach into that point, we cannot see beyond that, beyond the pleasure. So I think that most people are following that way. Sorry, laugh about Paul comment. Wait, I got lost. I do believe that Mill is doing something really tricky, which is putting in the same bag displeasure together with suffering, which is not the same thing. And I think that that's the tricky part where I'm not sure if we, but at least me and all my personalities, what they feel like this is the complex part. Stoicism is saying something like it will not be pleasure, but it will also not be suffering. So it will be like this in between thing. And you will only achieve that as long as you follow your own identity with these lenses, let's say, there are the pillars where you follow that which is kind of like it's like agreeing with your inner self. I think that's where it's coming from. Maybe I'm too optimistic about people always being innerly good, and that's kind of like wrong for me. Sorry. But yeah, that's me.
No, I know. I know what you mean. There's an academic. He's a famous linguist. He also doubles as a philosopher, but he's mainly known for his linguistics. Noam Chomsky says the same thing all the time. He sounds like an optimist. He won't say he's an optimist. He'll just say that he's just observing the facts and then inducing conclusions from them. But that's his modus operandi, that he sees creative passions in people that you can't, of course you can't deny that people act on their passions and act on their impulses sometimes and sometimes often. You can't deny that, but you also can't deny the fact that generally people are genuinely just, even if it's just by intention, it's not by their action, but at least by their intention, that most people don't intend to do harm, and most people don't intend to do evil, and most people are genuinely not just doing that, but they're not just not intending to do these things, they're also intending to do something creative, to express themselves, to do something that is benefiting others, even, and benefiting yourself. But of course, like you take that in context. I mean, you also think of the banality of evil. You also have to accept the fact that some people are just wrong when they're doing something they think is right, but it's just most people understand is totally wrong. But yeah, I think that people have a more rational compass than just, which Mill agrees with. I think Mill agrees that there's a rational faculty. He does agree with the Stoics on this, that there is a natural rational capability of humans that other animals don't have. And so rationally, we gravitate towards pleasure, even if we don't admit it, even if it's unconscious. In a way, our mind is working rationally to determine that this thing is pleasurable and it improves our utility, and therefore we should, achieve its end. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't read too much of Mill. I'll pass it to you, Paul, in just a second. I'll end with this. I haven't read too much of Mill to really get to know him. I mean, it took me months to really get a good enough grasp of Stoicism to start really, guiding discussions and doing these monthly introduction to Stoicism presentations that I do on Mondays. So, but I think it'll probably take the same amount of time for any other philosopher like Mill or Montaigne. But maybe in the future we do a month of Mill. We have one of the books of the month we do on Mill, which would be quite nice. But yeah, I still haven't wrapped my head around exactly what he's saying, but I don't necessarily think that he's saying that what we're doing is irrational, but but I do agree that he's missing out on some of the kind of the more genuine instincts humans have about goodness and creativity and things that are not necessarily for happiness. They're for, yeah. I think he's speaking more naturally and biologically, that, under the hood, the reason why we act at all is to improve our happiness or emotional well-being, just because that's how our instincts are built in, and that they ultimately drive us. So I think he's speaking more from the perspective of what's really mechanically and physically driving us. That even though we're acting rationally in all respects, you just can't help. It's kind of like unavoidable. No matter the logic or the planning that you do, it's your mind is working to be happy. Paul.
So the first thing that really comes to mind is I'm also going to post a link to what Lawrence Kohlberg was defining as the stages of moral development. So if we just, if you Google Lawrence Kohlberg and pyramid or so, you will see this pyramid of moral development where, like, stage 1 would be like you obey all the rules because you just want to avoid punishment, you're obedient. And then stage 3 or 4 would be like you want to be liked and you avoid disapproval. And step 6 is like kind of more or less Stoicism, where you say, okay, there are like these principles of conscience, so you're just good because it's
the right thing to do, and you want everybody else to be good as well, and virtuous too. So I like this, the Kohlberg's idea, and I suppose it kind of fits to Stoicism in a way. I would place Stoicism obviously at the top of the pyramid. You can see it in the Wikipedia entry, kind of, if you scroll down a little, there is this model shown as a graphic. So I don't know if this answers any question, but it helps me to put things into perspective.
No, thank you. Thank you for posting that. Also, it's of true educational interest to me because it sounds like he's developing his theory from Jean Piaget. If you study education and pedagogy, you study him. And also, if you study psychology, you study him. And he also, it parallels that exact moral development, but his is more learning development. When Jean Piaget is more at stage 5, so at the bottom, when you're first developing your ability to learn, you can only learn about concrete objects and about the idea of presence and absence, and then you upgrade to the idea of and then you work your way toward higher levels of abstraction. What kind of concepts, concrete towards abstraction, can you learn, and how can you learn more tangibly versus more aesthetically and abstractly. So he has the same kind of parallel kind of developmental theory, which has been modified over time, but it's still quite popular. And this is quite interesting. I really have to take a look at this. I wonder, I'm interested in reading the Wikipedia page because I wonder if this has been tested, like if there's ever been done a study kind of tracking people over time or giving people tasks or activities to do and kind of testing whether or not this is this somehow correlates with at what stage in our developmental process we're in, and if our actions correlate with one of these stages. I actually would not be surprised if it is, just because
I think it is, and part of that study is related to the Montessori school.
Kohlberg or Jean Piaget?
Piaget, sorry.
No, Piaget, of course. I'm talking about Kohlberg. Sorry, I
got confused.
Piaget, of course. There's been studies, and yeah, the Montessori schools are Montessori and Piaget influenced a lot. But I'm talking about Kohlberg, and I'm wondering if there's the same kind of studies done on his moral developmental scheme. That would just be quite interesting. Yeah, just a thought. Those are all kind of the significant questions I had. I mean, just to recap, I also agree with you, Gonzalo, and that there's something more going on under the hood for humans. Although that's just speculation. I honestly don't really know. I have to read more on the subject, because this brings me more into, every time we go into ethics, we also delve a little bit into cognitive science. So I feel like maybe we should do kind of a month of just looking at cognitive scientific results and seeing what they say, because we always end up saying, yeah, but what does in practice how we found in neuroscience or cognitive science today? Alvaro, I kind of also want to side with you, because I also feel like that even if it's not a principle of pleasure or happiness or utility or avoidance of pain, that there is something underneath the hood that humans are driven by, that drives pretty much everything else in terms of behavior and action. And I don't know if that's pleasure, but I feel like there is like, we're not fooling ourselves, but that there's but that there may be something there. Because
I just want to clarify that that's not my perception, or that's not what I think. I've been trying to explain my understanding of utilitarianism. Is not my own philosophy or my individual philosophy. But I do agree with what you mentioned, that I believe that was maybe a huge statement, great for a conclusion of this topic. Not that I'm wrapping up the conversation, but I do believe the great thing that they are missing is the idea of people wanting to do good or wanting to act in a certain way that is completely detached from just the idea of gaining something out of it. So yeah, I thought that was a very good point, Steve.
Thank you. I think this is probably another next time kind of topic to discuss. Maybe we should do a future episode on because we're actually kind of bordering on the debate between free will and determinism. Because as much as predeterministic the Stoics felt like, they're fatalistic, the Stoics felt like, built into their metaphysical worldview, they firmly believe that you could grasp control of your will independent of any kind of internal biological mechanism. Whereas Mill is basically dismissing that. He's saying that no, at base, there's some principle that your body is running on, like an algorithm in a computer, that you can have a certain extent of freedom of choice, but to an extent, and maybe you could become aware of that first principle, but to an extent, there's always that first principle that will drive your algorithm. And you can change the algorithm, but you can't change the goal at which the algorithm is always oriented towards. I think that's what he's saying, to make a comparison or an analogy with computers. Gonzalo.
Yeah, but I also think that that's kind of like not the thing that it works. Otherwise, the nurture versus I forgot. The born versus nurtured argument will be over. Kind of like, you're born in a certain way or within a certain context, and then that means that it is. That's it. That's the only thing that you know, and we can observe that that's not correctly true. You modify your behavior and your reward system depending on the context as much as from praises and other sort of things. So I think that we are kind of like bordering some really weird paths. Because if it, at least from the Buddhist perspective, kind of like your frontal precortex can do anything that it likes and override everything inside your brain, and allegedly the one that it's speaking is my frontal lobe. Allegedly, because we don't know, but it might be the lizard brain. We never know. So kind of like I feel like some science have kind of like this has done some of explanations related to yes, as long as you practice and you continuously practice, you will have more skills related to controlling these other parts of your natural behavior for some sort of shortcut, rather than just like, yeah, you're screwed. It's better kill you because you don't work anymore. Your brain is fixed that way. Sorry. Everything is set. Ta-da! That's kind of like my take on that. Sorry.
No, I understand your take. There's a few rebuttals, but to be honest, I don't think I want to take the time to go through that. Yeah, let's go at them. That would be, so I have a couple of questions about next steps, which this could lead into. So next week, next Sunday, I haven't made the event yet. I got to set it up tonight. The walk this past weekend went great. There were a lot of people who joined up on the walk, and I'm thinking of making the walk every other week. A walk or a cafe. So I'm also thinking about calling up a cafe to just ask that a couple cafes that I know and just ask if we can reserve a table, or it'd be okay if 10 or 11 people can come by and group at that place for a couple hours. That way we don't always have to walk outside, and we don't always have to, just in case of the weather. 2 weeks from now, though, I expect to do a whole nother virtual discussion, and we're not there yet at our book of the month, which is on the 9th. That's in 4 weeks. So we have one more virtual discussion before the book of the month, which is a new Stoicism. So our next virtual event will be on the 25th. I'm wondering if you guys have any ideas about the, before I make a proposal, maybe do you have any ideas about a topic or a format for our next discussion?
I was kind of like trying to think about it, but I mean, I don't really want to get into because I feel like the next one, it will be the conversation between Foucault and the guy that you just mentioned. Sorry, wait, it's the tip of my tongue.
Wait, you just broke up a little bit. What was the what were you describing? Foucault and versus who?
The linguist. Wait.
Oh, Chomsky.
Chomsky.
Yeah, his famous video,
There's a famous video, a 1 hour video, I think, related to this conversation. I think it's from the 70s. Yes, I'm breaking up. Sorry. I think that there's a discussion related to this particular topic, kind of like Chomsky saying people are naturally good and they wanted to do is good, and Foucault is actually saying no, people are depending on a lot of different things and you're kind of like blind. Maybe we can do something like that. I feel like that it will be it won't be fun to talk about another person conversation, kind of like that's their debate, but I think that we are going towards that, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, because the debate about free will versus determinism kind of intersects at its heart with the idea of whether or not we are driven by anything innate and fixed, and whether or not we are malleable by the outside world. I don't think either side is clear cut, and I think that's to kind of punch back at you. I think that's a mischaracterization of what both Foucault and Chomsky are saying. But it would be interesting maybe to hold that debate, maybe to kind of have, instead of a discussion, we can have an open discussion as well, but also prepare ahead of time for ourselves to kind of just watch the lecture. And I can find a couple of other links or a couple of other sources, not primary sources necessarily. Reading Foucault is a whole other project, and maybe, but yeah, exactly. But perhaps we can, maybe I can find essays by Chomsky and Foucault. Maybe that's a bit simpler, or maybe I can find good summaries, non-Wikipedia summaries about what they're trying to say in this debate. Because there has to be some context somewhere out on the internet. This debate is famous. It's on YouTube for free. So yeah, I think this is a good one. I think we'll do this. We'll frame it as the intersection of these couple of questions, and I'll frame it more of an open discussion or debate in this regard. I'm also going to shelve John Stuart Mill, because we're going to come back to him. I think this would be good to come back to his work, because utilitarianism is still so foundational that we can't dismiss it. And also, he's saying something truly interesting about human nature, and his system of logic is quite different also. The rest of his system of logic speaks, because that quote is at the end of one of his chapters, but most of his system of logic isn't really about utility. It's more about the process of induction and about deriving principles from observations. And it's more about logic purely, and it is quite interesting because it does overlap a lot with Stoicism more than you might think. So we'll shelve Mill. We'll in 2 weeks we'll come back to this debate, and that'll be it. The core will be if you want to watch the video, and then if you want to go on to other sources. Yeah, so I'll make the links for these. Alvaro, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that these debates, we don't have to reach a conclusion on one side being right and the other one being wrong. I don't think that's the idea of debating these philosophies. I think there is truth. There can be truth to all of them, right? And And the idea of learning from different perspectives, not necessarily saying, okay, this one is right and this one is wrong. And I think that should also be an understanding that we ought to have as we discuss among ourselves, because I feel that, at least I can't speak for myself, but I do believe that oftentimes I'm being interpreted as if I was reaching a conclusion, and that is not the case. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up.
No, yeah, no, I completely. Sorry, Gonzalo, go ahead.
That's why I also wanted to suggest that maybe we should do the opposite perspectives, kind of like sometimes we tend to have a fixed mindset, and maybe learning will be better if we do the opposite perspective that we are usually accustomed to think of.
Yeah, playing also it would be interesting if we played devil's advocate with each other. If we force ourselves to kind of have a debate, but we all say these are the sides we're on. Okay, so now let's flip it, and we all argue for the other side. That would be quite interesting to do. Let's see how that goes. Let's see. Let's run this. Let's run the feel of the room. Also, if there's more people who join us next in 2 weeks. But I agree with that, and I also agree with Alvaro. I mean, absolutely, arguments and debates don't have to come to a conclusion. They can, but they don't have to. And now it's not to say that there's no answer to the question, but that we haven't gotten there. That's the whole point of the debate. I think the point of the debate is that it's open-ended, that we haven't answered it yet. So obviously we need to debate more on the topic. So yeah, I think it's also good to stress that. I'll also write a little bit there in the event page about that, because if I frame it as a debate, maybe I'll frame it like that. Like the whole point is not to address an answer to a question, but to address the question itself, and to if I frame it like a devil's advocate kind of argument, maybe that's a little bit better painted as we're just interested in different sides of an argument rather than an answer to the question. So that's wonderful. Thank you guys for joining. You've really made this discussion go really, really well. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I'll see everybody next week / in 2 weeks.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Have a good weekend.
Good evening. Bye-bye.